Have you ever stopped and wondered, a Japanese company is buying oil from Saudi Arabia, but they're not paying in yen. They're not paying in reals. They're paying in dollars. American dollars, from a country that isn't even part of the transaction. Not only that, a Brazilian farmer sells soybeans to a Chinese factory in dollars. A German automaker hedges its risk on global markets in dollars. A tiny country in Southeast Asia stores its national savings in dollars. The dollar is everywhere, like that one friend who somehow gets invited to every party, even the ones they weren't invited to. So, how did this happen? To understand how the dollar took over the world, you first need to rewind. Way back, before Wall Street, before Washington even mattered. For most of the 19th century, the world didn't revolve around America. It revolved around London. The British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's landmass, but land wasn't the real power. Trade routes were. Ships carrying cotton, coal, silk, and spices. All of them moved through British-controlled ports, financed by British banks, and settled in one currency, the British pound. If you wanted to trade internationally, you needed pounds. That's it. No pounds, no deal. But Britain's power wasn't built on paper money alone. It was built on gold. Under the gold standard, currencies were backed by physical gold stored in vaults. Governments couldn't simply print money whenever they wanted. If a country ran out of gold, it ran out of credibility. For decades, the system worked, and Britain sat at the center of it. But history has a pattern. Every dominant currency eventually follows the same path as the power behind it. The Portuguese real, the Spanish dollar, the Dutch guilder. One by one, each ruled the world, until the empires supporting them began to decline. The British pound was no exception. Its dominance looked permanent until 2 world wars changed everything. In 1914, a single assassination in Sarajevo helped trigger a war that would reshape the global balance of power. World War I devastated Europe. Britain, France, and Germany emerged exhausted, heavily indebted, and economically weakened. The United States, meanwhile, was in a very different position. Before officially entering the war in 1917, America spent years supplying the Allies with food, weapons, and industrial goods, and much of the payment arrived in gold. By the time the war ended, the world's financial center was already beginning to shift across the Atlantic. America had transformed from a debtor nation into the world's largest creditor. The gold was there, the industry was there, and increasingly, so was the power. Then came World War II, and this time, the destruction was even greater. Cities were bombed, factories were destroyed, entire economies were left in ruins. While much of Europe was fighting for survival, American factories were running at full speed, producing the ships, tanks, aircraft, and supplies that helped win the war. By 1945, the numbers told the story. The United States had the world's largest economy. It produced an enormous share of global industrial output, and most importantly, it held the majority of the world's gold reserves. Remember the rule of the gold standard: no gold, no credibility. And America had the gold. By the end of the war, the old financial order was gone. The question was no longer whether power had shifted. It was how the world would build a new financial system around that reality. The answer would come in 1944, at a small conference in New Hampshire. By 1944, it was obvious that the old financial order was finished. Europe was exhausted by war. America held most of the world's gold, and everyone knew a new system had to be built. So delegates from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to answer a simple question. What comes next? One proposal was to create a brand new global currency that no country controlled. The Americans weren't interested, because when you hold most of the world's gold, you don't need a neutral system. You need your system. The agreement they reached was simple: Other currencies would be tied to the US dollar, and the dollar would be tied to gold at a fixed rate. In other words, the dollar became the bridge between every currency and the world's most trusted asset. For the first time in history, a single country's currency sat at the center of the global economy. And for a while, the system worked. Trade expanded, economies recovered. The dollar became the foundation of international finance. But success created a new problem. As the global economy grew, the world needed more dollars, and America kept printing them. By the late 1960s, there were far more dollars circulating than the gold needed to back them. Countries started to notice. If everyone exchanged their dollars for gold at the same time, the United States simply didn't have enough. The system was running out of road. Then, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that changed global finance forever. The United States would stop exchanging dollars for gold. Just like that, the link between money and gold was broken. The foundation of the Bretton Woods system disappeared overnight. Economists predicted disaster. Many believed the dollar would collapse. Instead, something unexpected happened. The dollar survived, and soon it became even more powerful than before, because America was already preparing a new foundation for its currency. One built not on gold, but on oil. But replacing gold with oil wasn't automatic. The dollar had lost the very thing that gave it credibility for decades. So the question became, what could convince the world to keep using dollars if those dollars could no longer be exchanged for gold? The answer arrived during another global crisis. In 1973, a new crisis shook the world. The Arab-Israeli War triggered an oil embargo, sending energy prices soaring and pushing many economies into turmoil. Suddenly, the United States and its allies were forced to confront a difficult reality. Modern economies ran on oil, and much of that oil came from the Middle East. In response, the United States reached a quiet agreement with Saudi Arabia. The arrangement was simple. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in US dollars and invest much of its oil revenue back into American financial assets. In return, the United States would provide security and military support. Soon, other major oil producers followed the same model. And just like that, the world's most important commodity was effectively tied to the dollar. The impact was enormous. If a country wanted oil, it first needed dollars. Japan needed dollars. Germany needed dollars. China, India, Brazil. Everyone needed dollars. Demand for the currency was no longer driven by gold. It was driven by energy, and that gave the United States an extraordinary advantage. The dollar was no longer backed by a vault full of gold. It was backed by something equally powerful: the world's dependence on oil. And behind that system stood American economic and military power. That wasn't an accident. It was strategy. But oil alone can't explain the dollar's staying power. More than 50 years after Nixon ended the gold standard, the dollar is still on top, not surviving, dominating. Why? Because once a currency becomes dominant, it develops something incredibly powerful: momentum. The world trades in dollars. Countries save in dollars. Investors trust dollars. And when a crisis hits, whether it's a war, a recession, or a pandemic, money doesn't run away from the dollar. It runs toward it. Which sounds a little strange if you think about it. Imagine being on a ship that's taking on water, and everyone's response is to run toward the captain. That's basically the dollar. Even when the problem starts in America, investors often buy more dollars. That's how deeply embedded the system has become. And it's not just about trust, it's about infrastructure. For decades, global trade, financial markets, and central banks have all been built around the dollar. Trying to replace it isn't like changing your phone. It's like trying to replace the internet while everyone is still using it. Possible? Maybe. Easy? Not even close. And that's where America's real advantage comes from. Because the dollar isn't just a currency, it's the operating system of the global economy. Most people never see it, just like most people never think about the plumbing inside their house until it stops working. The same is true for the dollar. It's quietly sitting behind an enormous share of global trade and finance, and that gives the United States something few countries have ever had: leverage. Because if the dollar sits at the center of the financial system, access to that system becomes a source of power. Economic power, political power, sometimes even strategic power. Which means the dollar isn't just a piece of paper or a number on a screen. It's one of the most influential tools ever created. And that's why, more than 50 years after losing its link to gold, the dollar remains the currency the world can't seem to quit. But history has a habit of humbling dominant powers. Every reserve currency in history eventually faced challengers. The Dutch guilder did. The British pound did. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If the dollar's position is so strong, can anyone actually replace it? The short answer? Maybe. The realistic answer? Not anytime soon. And that's because replacing the dollar is much harder than replacing a currency. It's more like replacing the foundation of a skyscraper while people are still living inside it. China is trying. For years, Beijing has been expanding the international use of the yuan, building alternative payment networks, and reducing its reliance on the dollar. The BRICS countries have also talked about creating systems that would give them more financial independence from the United States. Then there's the euro. It's already one of the world's most important currencies and often gets mentioned as the most credible challenger. And of course, some people believe digital currencies or cryptocurrencies could eventually change the game entirely. But here's the problem. Every alternative seems to be missing something. China has economic scale, but many investors still worry about capital controls and government intervention. The euro has strong financial markets, but Europe doesn't always act as a single political power. And Bitcoin. Well, it's difficult to become the foundation of global finance when your price can look like a roller coaster designed by a caffeinated engineer. The challenge isn't creating an alternative. The challenge is creating an alternative that the entire world trusts, because the dollar isn't sitting on top simply because America says so. It's sitting on top because governments, banks, businesses, and investors have spent decades building around it, and systems like that don't disappear overnight. History proves they can fall. The British pound did, but it took 2 world wars and a massive shift in global power to make it happen. Which raises the real question, are the forces pushing against the dollar today strong enough to do the same? So far, not quite. Which is exactly what makes the story of the dollar so remarkable. Because when the gold standard collapsed in 1971, many people thought the dollar's best days were behind it. Instead, it became even more central to the world economy. And that brings us to the bigger picture. From Bretton Woods, to the collapse of the gold standard, to the rise of the petrodollar. The story of the dollar is really the story of how global power evolves. The dollar didn't become the world's currency because it was destined to. It became the world's currency because of a series of decisions. A conference in a small hotel in New Hampshire, deals negotiated behind closed doors, wars that reshaped the global balance of power, and leaders making choices that would affect billions of people they would never meet. That's how the global financial system was built. Not all at once, and not always in public. Over the decades, the system has been challenged again and again, yet the dollar remained at the center. The modern global economy was built around the dollar. International trade, financial markets, government reserves. Entire institutions depend on it. The dollar is more than a currency. It's the language of global finance. And for decades, the world has spoken that language. But no language lasts forever. The British pound once seemed unstoppable. So did every dominant currency before it. The real question isn't whether the system will change. It's what comes next when it does.